Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Roy Young, and I'm the President and CEO of James Madison's Montpelier. I'd like to welcome you to a special Constitution Day edition of Constitution 101. For those of you who are Montpelier members, thank you for your participation and support of our programs. We love to see you on site and through our virtual programs like these. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. If you're not a member of James Madison's Montpelier, I'd like to invite you to consider joining. During the month of September, all new and increased gifts will be matched by the Nancy Woodson Spire Foundation. This means a new member joins at $50 and the impact is a gift of $100. Among many benefits, your membership features free entry to all virtual programming, and we have quite a few upcoming virtual events you won't want to miss. We'll give you a sneak peek at the end of tonight's program. Just 2 days ago, we celebrated the 234th anniversary of the signing of the UN's Constitution. The framers intended the Constitution to be a fundamental framework of law. They did not want the Constitution to be changed in response to transient whims. However, they also recognized that American society and conditions would change over time in ways they could not predict in 1787. George Mason said, "Amendments, therefore, will be necessary, and it will be better to provide for them in an easy, regular, and constitutional way than to trust to chance and violence." Article 5 of the Constitution lays out the amendment process, and since 1787, more than 10,000 proposed amendments have been introduced to Congress. Only 33 amendments have gained enough votes to be submitted to the states for ratification, and just 27 have been ratified. So is it too difficult to amend our Constitution? During today's program, our speakers will address some of the major issues surrounding constitutional reform and whether and how major reforms can be achieved. We look forward to today's conversation about these important questions. But first, let me introduce our guest speakers. William Treanor is the Dean and Executive Vice President of Georgetown University Law Center, and he holds the Law Center's Paul Regis Dean Leadership Professorship. He joined the the Georgetown University Law Center in 2010 from Fordham Law School, where he had been Dean of the Law School since 2002 and Paul Fuller Professor. George Van Cleve is Dean's Visiting Scholar, Georgetown University Law Center. He was formerly Research Professor in Law and History at Seattle University School of Law, and he holds a PhD from the University of Virginia and a JD from Harvard Law School. They're joined today by my colleague, Emily Voss, Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution here at Montpelier. And she'll be monitoring the chat box throughout the discussion, so please feel free to post your questions as we progress. Our speakers will pause for Q&A periodically throughout the program. And now I'll turn this over to Bill and to George. To you, gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much, Roy. And George?
No, please go ahead, Bill.
Okay. I just wanted to say, what an honor it is to be here. And I know, speaking for George as well as myself, to be invited to Montpelier and on Constitution Day is incredibly meaningful. So really delighted to be here. And thank you for this opportunity. What we're going to be focusing on at the very start is what doesn't work about the Constitution. And George has written, and I just want to, for our audience, book, Making a New American Constitution, really an extraordinary book. And one of the things that I found very compelling about it, and George will talk about it more, is that it really challenges us with basic principles. What doesn't work about the Constitution, and what do we do about that? And somebody who's been in law teaching for more than 30 years, I really welcome this because this is really a critical moment for consideration of that. And we don't normally do it at law schools. Law schools are really classically about taking the next step, or sometimes about understanding an area of the law, but not about, stepping back and saying, where doesn't it work and what do we do about it in a big picture way? And that's what this book is about, and that's really what our conversation will be about. So let me start with what I think doesn't work about the Constitution, that's really our first arc here. I think the core value of the Constitution is that it's a document of democratic governance. It uses Republican government principles. We elect representatives, we elect a president. They're the one who, in some ways, govern. But at its core, this is about democracy. All men are created equal. All people are created equal. That's our core principle. So where do we see that doesn't work in our Constitution today? And I really find that, what we have to focus on is, where is the voting process? Where doesn't it work? So issues that I'm very concerned about are gerrymandering, and I'm very concerned about campaign finance. Gerrymandering is, the Supreme Court a couple of years ago in the Rucco case said that the Supreme Court doesn't intervene in gerrymandering. It's a political question, unless there's racial inequities or kind of other special areas. But if it's partisan gerrymandering and the state legislature is skewing districts so that as much as possible people will be from the legislature's dominant party, Supreme Court's not going to intervene. And that's a crucial flaw in democratic governance that the Supreme Court has set as part of our constitutional framework. So I'm actually right now I'm talking from New Jersey, hence the New Jersey map behind me. But right now I live in Maryland, and the Maryland legislature basically packed all the Republicans into one district, so that every other congressperson in the state was a Democrat and you had one Republican. And the Supreme Court said, that's a political question. We're not going to look into that, right? Campaign finance, the power of money is really drowning out the power of individual choice. And again, that's a Supreme Court decision. So Citizens United allowed PACs to flood, social media, to flood TV and radio, without any checks on their expenditures. So those are, and actually, I think we're going to see, more things in the years ahead. So Bonta, which was a Supreme Court case from last term, was one which, I think in the way forward, it suggested you're not going to have to disclose, who your donors are. So that was a limited case about California rules, but I think the underlying logic is very broad. So those are two areas. So I think the overlying under the basic principle of the Constitution is one person, one vote. Those are two areas in which Supreme Court decisions are really undermining it profoundly. But there are also problems that are just kind of in the Constitution itself in the most powerful way. And the biggest problem is really the power of the states and the Senate and the Electoral College. So again, going back to my map, everybody in Montpelier I'm sure knows that New Jersey at the Federal Constitutional Convention said every state should get an equal representation in the legislature. So there was a compromise, and the Senate though represents the New Jersey point of view, and the Electoral College gives great weight to the states. So that's part of the reason why we've seen a number of minority presidents. So I started off with two things where I think the Supreme Court got it wrong, but there are also things that are deeply ingrained in the Constitution. So that's what I see as the problem. George, what do you see?
Well, Bill, first of all, let me say that I really appreciate your willingness to participate in this conversation, because as your presentation shows, this is something you've given a lot of thought to. I would say that I agree with the basic point you're making about the notion that the Constitution was intended to create an effective political democracy. Obviously, at the time, suffrage was limited. and so on. But that's the core principle, was to create an egalitarian republic. But the concern I've got, and so I share a lot of the concerns that you've expressed about gerrymandering, the Electoral College, and so on. But the concern I've got really goes further, because in a sense, the concerns you've described are not enough democracy. The Constitution should be more democratic. The concern I have is that we're in danger of losing our democracy. Now, what do I mean by that? I think, and my book tries to show, that we face enormous social problems that are not being resolved. Just to take an example, the level of economic inequality in the United States is so substantial that it is threatening the existence of the middle class. And one thing that's fairly clear in democratic theory, and in a recent book by Ganesh Siddharaman, for example, is if you don't have a middle class, you can't have a democracy. And really, our Constitution is founded on the notion that there will be a middle class. So that economic inequality, which is far larger than it was 40 years ago, is threatening the existence of the middle class. And of course, it's also far more damaging to people of color than it is to the rest of the population. And you can see that these kinds of problems, and the pandemic, the treatment of people of color in the pandemic itself, their differential access to healthcare, their differential exposure to the disease and so on, has got a lot of people really angry about the way the country is being run by the government. And the Constitution is our decision-making framework for the government. So if it isn't working right, we really have a fundamental problem. And there are people at this point, and the New York Times recently quoted a USC law professor, Fernita Tolson, as saying that it's her view that serious change isn't going to occur without violence. And that's how grave I think the problems we're facing are. And I'm determined to try and find a way to bring about peaceful change in order to avoid the necessity for violent change that I think many people are beginning to think might happen. So as I say, I think we're in danger of losing our democracy, not just of not having enough democracy. And that's why the structural issues that you referred to at the end are one of my major concerns. We are, as a country, the Constitution puts us in a position where it provides protections, and you described the campaign finance protections, but there are structural protections in the Constitution for wealthy people and politically powerful people. The Constitution also structurally allows minorities to make fundamental decisions, whether it's electing presidents or putting Supreme Court justices on the Supreme Court for life. So we don't have a full republic. But beyond that, we don't have a government that actually works. The separation of powers, which is the core of the Constitution's decision-making structure at the federal level, is broken. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. The New York Times had a column a couple of weeks ago by Greg Weiner, a thoughtful political scientist, in which he said that we have all of the vices of the separation of powers, and in effect, none of the virtues. What he meant was, and I think I want to rephrase that because I think I've mischaracterized what he said. He compared separation of power system to parliamentary democracies, and essentially said that we are now a de facto parliamentary democracy, but that we don't have any of the benefits that you would get out of having a real parliamentary democracy. Now, what's clear to me is we can't re-examine those kinds of fundamental structural issues in the Constitution on a piecemeal basis. For example, if you increase the power of the president, which some people think would be a good idea, and you don't think at all about the Congress, you're weakening the Congress. It's a zero-sum game. And as a result, you're taking away one of the pillars of separation of powers. So I think that if you're going to re-examine the Constitution at that level, you're going to have to do it in a more systematic way than saying, let's fix gerrymandering, let's try to fix the electoral college and so on. I agree with you that those are all problems, but I think we're in a deeper political hole than that. And as a result, I think we need to look at a broader set of solutions.
So let me follow up on that. So, if you
Sure.
look at kind of the arc of economic inequality in the
Right.
United States, right? So starting in the Civil War, really running through up to the New Deal,
Right.
there was increasing stratification,
Yes.
dramatic, right?
Right.
And then starting in roughly, 1935 with
Right.
Roosevelt, right? It was really, again, for 40 years, dramatic compression
Yes.
until, depending on the survey, roughly 1972, 73,
Right.
right? And then starting then, the obverse, again, we've been compacting and now dramatic differences, right? So we're starting to look more like 1875 as
Yes.
opposed to 1965, right?
Correct.
So one question is, how does your constitutional analysis fit into that? Why was it that at one point we were getting, the middle class was growing,
Right.
right? And now it's shrinking. And is that just constitution? Is that the key to reform? And what's changed?
Okay. Those are all fair questions. And given the amount of time we have today, I'm going to have to be fairly quick and easy about a response. But the level of global competition that we're facing today is unprecedented. And it, as an exogenous factor, it plays an enormous effect on driving down leverage for workers, incomes, wages, and so on. And so we're stuck with that level of global competition, whether we like it or not. And what the Constitution does, in effect, is to make the situation worse. And it does that partially by the campaign financing that you described, which allowed 12 people to contribute $3.4 billion to political candidates. Those guys are not contributing $3 billion because they want things to change. Most of what they're doing is saying to people, leave us alone. So part of the problem is campaign finance, but the Constitution itself has both political protections for wealth and legal protections for wealth. It's not at all clear that if a wealth tax were adopted by Congress, it would survive this Supreme Court's constitutional review. And wealthy people know that. And beyond that, the political structure of the Constitution, which gives disproportionate power to small states. The small states are the defenders at this point of the traditional economy. They are not the knowledge economy. They are the traditional economy. They're going to try and defend it. And one of the ways they do that is to oppose redistribution systematically. So that if someone says, no, I think we really should tax wealthy people more, most of their representatives are saying, no, 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 what we need to do is tax less, not tax those people more, not tax anyone. So we end up in a situation where you don't even have the political will to pay for programs that would collapse inequality by taxing someone to pay for them.
Okay,
so that's
I mean,
a kind of long
right.
way around, but
Yeah, no, I think that's so part of it is kind of world situation, right?
yes,
But part of it is also kind of the political structure. So,
absolutely.
so actually, let me just before we I'd like to follow up on that because I think this is an area where we, have some disagreement. But Emily Voss, who's asking questions, is there anything that you want to bring forward, or should George and I continue with our conversation?
Why don't you go ahead and continue? I have a couple of questions queued up, but please go ahead and continue. This is a great overview.
Okay. So actually, George, one thing that I was doing that was, was really very striking to me was in advance of this conversation, I went back and I looked at the 1960 presidential election, Kennedy, Nixon. So,
Right.
and there were a couple of things that really struck me. So that was famously a hairbreadth selection, 0.1%, right?
Yes.
But it actually wasn't that close in the electoral college. Kennedy won by about 80 electoral votes, right? And and it was also fascinating if you looked at what states went Democrat and what states went Republican.
Right.
To a striking extent, it was almost a mirror image of 2020.
Yes.
So I mean, in other words, like the Northeast, the New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, in both cases they went Democratic.
Right.
But the South was Democratic in 1960, and it was Republican in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
And the West, particularly the far West Coast,
Mm-hmm.
was actually solidly Republican in
Mm-hmm.
1960. California went Republican, and not just, I mean, Nixon was from California, but it had been kind of traditionally, as much a Republican and more Republican state than a Democratic state. Right. So I guess one question that I have as I'm thinking about is, first of all, one of your core points is that the small states, small
Right.
in terms of population, will be anti-redistribution.
Mm-hmm.
And isn't that kind of a phenomenon in the moment? Can't that change through politics? In other words, these are the states that are doing poorly economically.
Yes.
Shouldn't people there, if the argument is made to them right, say, what, we really should be in favor of redistribution because we're at the bottom of the economic pyramid.
Your point about sort of large shifts in pattern over time obviously is perfectly legitimate. But the generation or two that we are looking at now, running from about 1970 to the present, has a sort of configuration that has shifted into today's structure, okay? And there's every indication that that structure is more tightly aligned now than really would have been true probably for the prior 100 years in terms of the solidity of people's choices, their opinions, where they're locating. I mean, one of the common observations that political scientists make about polarization is that people are geographically sorting themselves. They can do that. They are doing that. So on the one hand, can things change over a 100-year period of time? Yes, I think they can. Do we need to look at how the Constitution is functioning over a century period or over a period where we're systematically failing to address priority national issues? I think if you look at the last 20 years, what the Constitution has really given us is two minority presidents, both of whom people would say probably didn't do the world's best job in office. And it has given us Supreme Court justices chosen by a minority of the population. And the jury's still out on, how some of them are going to do. But the point is, if we have a structure that systematically distorts the popular will, which is the structure we currently have, and it is more distortive every day because of the way that the Senate works. If we have a structure that does that, we're going to increasingly make choices that people don't want to have made. And if things don't work out, they're going to think that they didn't have anything to say about what happened to them, which is why trust levels are at historic lows for the government. There has never been a time that we know of in our history when the government has had a lower level of public trust than it does today. So these distortions that are built into the current structure, and let me just say one more thing about the states. In the book, I point out that many of the states at this point, as a practical matter, are insolvent or bankrupt. I chose a group of 5 states and showed that the federal government, directly or indirectly, is providing more money to the citizens of those states than their entire state budgets. Those are states that if federal assistance was withdrawn tomorrow, would fall apart. They can't possibly tax to make up the difference in revenues. And so the idea that the states are viable units and we should use them without question to count everything is a really dubious assumption to make today, as opposed to 200 years ago, when if a state wasn't a viable unit, it fell apart. It had to have an army. And today we have states that not only don't have armies, they can't provide public health services, they can't provide education. And if the federal government withdrew its assistance to them, they would cease to exist. That's the reality here. So these small states have a lot to defend. And a lot of what they're defending is the way the status quo works. I don't see them announcing, and their representatives, if you just look at how the representatives vote, they're not voting for change.
Right. So I mean, so first of all, I think if you go back to 1787, one of the great debates is, are we a nation or are we a confederacy? Right. So, and I think, Governor Morris, who I've written about, one of the things that he's one of the great nationalists, and he says, I am an American. And he also says, the states have behaved badly and they should suffer more. So, so he's an example of a strong nationalist. Madison is a strong nationalist. Madison, of course, leaves disconsolate in 1787 because he hasn't achieved a lot of what he's wanted to achieve, and and the Senate is a big part of that. But I think but I would say, as we're thinking about it right now, there are two dimensions that you're talking about that I'd like to kind of probe you on, right? So one is, why is it that the poorest states, small states, get so much from the federal government? And that's, pork barrel, right? I mean, the 5, poorest states have 10 senators, right? And,
yes.
If they're going to vote for things, you build highways and you build bridges and you build, all kinds of government installations there, right? So that, that's pure pork barrel politics. The other part that you're talking about that I also want to kind of press you on, though, is the sense in which they're anti-redistributive.
Yes.
Right. In other words, I can see why they want, bridges and military bases and the other things that, are limited goods. But long term, why is it that they can't be convinced to support a wealth tax, for example, which you would think that's the California people who are going to be paying the wealth tax, the tech billionaires. So why is it that Wyoming or Montana doesn't say that's a great idea?
Okay, that is a completely fair question. And let me respond to it in 2 ways. The people from Montana and Wyoming are unlikely to have a choice about whether or not to impose a wealth tax on Californians, because the Constitution, there is a perfectly plausible view, would outlaw a wealth tax that was designed that way. That's part of what I wrote about in the book, and it's part of what I mean when I say the Constitution has a bias in favor of protecting the wealthy. As to your point about redistribution in small states, I guess what I would have to say to you is this: look at who represents those folks in Congress. Because realistically, of the 2 parties, and it's not fair to call them monoliths in any way, but of the 2 parties, one party typically favors programs that would involve a higher level of social welfare and some degree of wealth redistribution. The other party is opposed to increasing most forms of social welfare, and in fact, opposed to most forms of wealth redistribution. Again, a broad brush, right? But look at who represents the small states. It's the folks who generally are on the side of opposing increased economic fairness. I think, and I try to explain in the book, that they do that because times are hard in those states. People want to keep what they have. And unfortunately, at least as things currently exist, very often the small states are dominated by elites that are traditional elites within those states. For example, the coal companies in West Virginia. Historically, you really didn't want to cross a coal company in West Virginia because it had resources that would allow them to come back at you in a way that you would never forget. And in fact, in the book, I talk about one controversy that involved buying potentially part of the Supreme Court of West Virginia, involving a coal company executive. So these small states are represented by folks who think that a significant part of their job is A, to bring in as much in the way of federal benefits. And it's not just pork barrel spending, but it's also social welfare payments under existing laws. Their job is to maximize that. And their job is to protect the existing economy of those states, which very often is an economy that, from an environmental policy point of view, we probably would prefer to change. And so when it comes to something like climate change, I'm pretty sure that if you look at the numbers, the coastal states are going to be seeking real progress in climate change because they're really exposed to climate change, right? Not so much in Iowa. So my point about the small states is that many of them are traditional economies. Their representatives believe their job is to protect them as best they can. And it's not to say that over the longer term, you couldn't persuade them to support redistribution, but the New Deal is a really, I think, not a great example for your point of view because it was a crisis. It was a crisis. It was like the pandemic magnified 10 times. The banks were going to close on Tuesday and everything else was going to close on Wednesday. So people were a lot more open to doing whatever it was you could do to try to make life better for average folks. That's not the run-of-the-mill experience in Wyoming and Montana. The big ranches there, they just sold an 80,000 acre ranch in Montana for $130 million. Those folks are not going to be terribly excited about interference with the way they run the ranch. I have some distant family out there, and I think I can tell you that from personal experience.
Mhm.
So anyhow, that's my reaction.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the wealth tax.
Can we
right?
check in with Emily and see?
Yeah, Emily?
Sure. Yes. So a couple potential questions, which I might put out for your consideration. And if this is a good time, great. If not, we can maybe parking lot them and we can visit them later. But so one question has arisen with regards to the role of education of citizens in these structural malfunctions. So is it not perhaps just that these structures have become too large, too cumbersome, too overburdened, but is there something to consider when it comes to, frankly, the lack of civic education that has been the case over the past couple generations, with folks really only getting a semester of civics, a semester of government, is people's perhaps fundamental misunderstanding of the way that the federal government works part of this problem. And then perhaps somewhat along with that, people's perception of which element of government is responsible for what, is that also a cause for confusion and also cause for concern?
That's George, you want to start and then I'll follow up?
Sure. Well, first of all, I agree that civic education in the United States could be dramatically improved. But explaining to people that they really should understand how the separation of powers works isn't going to change the fact that it doesn't work. And the case I make in my book is that the core institutions created by the Constitution really no longer function in anything remotely like the way they were intended to function when the Constitution was written. And so while we can educate people, and I would hope we would educate people, and while I would like people to understand that this is not a sort of neutral machine that runs by itself, the fact of the matter is that they need to really understand something that goes beyond normal civic education, which is that we have a paper structure that works one way and an actual structure that works in a fundamentally different way at this point. So Bill, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so I think one thing that I think is clearly the case is that we don't do the kind of civic education that we should. And I think that's really a national crisis. We're not giving people an understanding of the basics of constitutional government. And I think, one of the consequences of that is that, it reinforces kind of a lack of responsibility of government actors. I have to say, one of the things that, that you talk about kind of very powerfully in your book is the way in which congressmen and senators evade responsibility. Right. I always, a moment that I always think of, as we're talking about Wyoming, was during the first Gulf War, and the question of whether the Senate would support intervention. And, Senator Simpson getting up on the floor and saying, I remember, during the war in Vietnam, I was a young lawyer, and I had a softball league, and I would play with other people my age, and I saw so many of those people who I knew, who were my friends, get drafted, fight in the war in Vietnam, and come home in body bags. And what was very powerful to me, was at a time in which, you had, the president was kind of thinking this in kind of a grand national dimension, right? That you had a senator, who was talking about kind of what he personally had experienced and what it had meant for his hometown and what it meant for the people he knew, right? And I think, one of the things that I think partially will address, this separation of powers crisis, which you accurately identify, is civic education, where both representatives and people realize, what the role of representatives is, and again, I mean, Simpson, just was so beautifully embodying that. And that's something that we've lost and that I would like to see more of. And again, I think civic education is a big part of that.
Well, I appreciate this story very much. I wish that there were more people in the Senate today who were as capable as Alan Simpson was and as honorable in their service. But the reason that congressmen avoid responsibility is because the system allows them to do that. And the incentives in the system are such that they're incentivized to avoid responsibility. And as I try to suggest in the book, if you have 400 or more safe seats in Congress, you're going to have a bunch of time servers who aren't terribly interested in standing up and taking a political hit for an unpopular position. So I think that beyond civic education, we have to change the incentives that confront people who are going to hold public office, that put them in a position where they need to take responsibility and be accountable. The system, unfortunately, has some built-in easy ways to avoid accountability. A member of the House of Representatives can say, I love this idea, but I know the Senate will never accept it. So no, I can't do it. Bicameralism is a built-in excuse for avoiding accountability. But unfortunately, the lack of competition, the fact that these are, at this point, lifetime career jobs, and I might say very highly paid by many people's standards and with enormously great benefits and staff, has created a culture where if you can avoid responsibility, very often that is what members of Congress will do. And so the president becomes more powerful because he becomes the focus not only of media attention, but of everyone saying, as happened during the eviction controversy recently, well, Congress didn't act, so now it's up to the president to, make something up. I mean, talk about avoiding responsibility. First the president says to Congress, you need to pass legislation to extend this eviction moratorium. And Congress then fails completely to even try to do that and turns around and says, no, you need to do something to fix this problem. We cannot continue to have a system where people can play, hide the ball under the little 3 Monty pieces as a way of doing business for the government. This is a decision-making system that isn't making decisions.
And I think gerrymandering is a big part of that, right? So let's go back to.
Let me just, since I didn't say much about gerrymandering, let me just sort of offer this up. Most political scientists who study gerrymandering think it may involve a swing of 30 seats. In other words, if you adopted the legislation that's currently pending in Congress, which I think it's highly unlikely will be adopted unless the filibuster is literally broken, But assume it's adopted. Most political scientists believe that's 30 seats that are in play. Some of them were in Maryland, for the Republicans, but some of them were Democrats in North Carolina. It balances out in such a way that there might be a net gain to one party or the other of 30 seats. That's not going to do much to take a divided Congress and move the needle one way or the other. I mean, I favor gerrymandering reform, just to be clear, but I don't see it as something that can really fundamentally change the incentive system that we're looking at that has developed over time. I mean, until 1946, Bill, congressmen didn't get pensions.
I did not know that.
Yeah, taxpayers were not paying pensions to congressmen. That had a tendency to shorten the terms of service. You didn't need term limits because people said, hey, I got to make a living. They're not going to pay me a pension here. We now have a system where, as you probably know, for a long period of time, Congress had the most generous pensions in the entire federal system. And it's only recently that somebody said, oh, that sounds like it's too much. You guys are already making a lot of money. We have to cut that back a little bit. But the incentives for people's behavior are really pretty fundamental. So to go back to this education point, I mean, I absolutely favor it. But I want people to start thinking about this is a decision-making system. The whole theory of separation of powers was to create incentives for each institution to jealously guard its prerogatives. Does it really seem to you that that's happening today, that Congress is guarding its prerogatives to legislate, and that it's saying to the Supreme Court, hey, you really shouldn't get to make those decisions. We're going to make them. That's not the reality today, I don't think.
Yeah, but I think so. Let me go back to gerrymandering. Let's talk about that. So there are really two issues with gerrymandering. One is it anti-democratic in that it skews what the House looks like, right? Sure. And as you say, political scientists indicate 30 votes, right? That's actually a big deal, but let's just focus on that for a minute. But the other is, what it does is, it creates incentives to not legislate. It creates, so let's take Maryland, right? Yes. So Maryland, basically there's one Republican district. And there are 8 Democratic districts, and those 8 Democratic districts are never going to have a Republican, and the Republican district's never going to have a Democrat, right? So, before you had kind of as elegant a gerrymandering system as we had now, right? What you had in order to be reelected, which you would have a real general election, right? So if you're a Democrat, there's a Republican who's running against you. If you're a Republican, there's a Democrat running against you. And what you have to do is to show that you did something. You have to show,
Absolutely.
Results, right?
Absolutely.
And results are, working in bipartisan fashion, right? That's the old system, right? But with gerrymandering, the only election that you have to worry about is the primary. So what you're going to do is you're going to run to your party's base, right? Because that's what you need to win in the primary. And so your goal is not to say I did stuff. Right. It's to say, I said stuff.
Well, I agree with what you just said, but I think you're sort of making my point, because what you're really saying is political competition is a good thing.
Yeah.
And ending gerrymandering is not going to restore political competition in most of the seats in most of the country. There are 400 non-competitive seats, and no one thinks that restoring gerrymandering, which I favor, ending gerrymandering, no one thinks that it's going to be enough to really restore the competition you're talking about, which, believe me, I think that competition is critical. Because years ago, when I was paying more attention to this sort of thing, I saw situations where a Democratic governor and Republican senators were at odds with each other about some issue that was really of importance to the state, and people had to produce. They had to show that they were actually getting something done, because if they didn't, they could count on the possibility that someone else was going to come after them about it. So we certainly agree about the underlying principle that we need incentives. I just don't think that gerrymandering in and of itself is going to get us there. And because really the entire institution, Congress as an entire institution, many people think is defunct. I mean, William Howell, who's a very capable political scientist at the University of Chicago, wrote a book with a colleague not too long ago, and it literally says, look, Congress is beyond hope, can't be fixed, and what we need to do is give the president more power to control the legislative agenda. Their basic proposal was, oh, the president should be allowed to force Congress to vote on whatever the president wants them to vote on, whether they want to or not. Now, I'm not in favor of that. In fact, I'm not in favor of giving presidents more power. But what I mentioned this to make the point that these are very capable political scientists, and their position is Congress is beyond hope. It's just not a functioning institution. And I don't think you can have a republic without a Congress. You can call it a republic if you want to, but it'd be like, the French Third Republic. I mean, it's not a republic in the way we think of one. So we've spent a lot of time on the sort of core question of what is reform desirable. Maybe we ought to talk about whether or not any of the individual reforms that people are interested in or that are popular really have any prospect of succeeding. What do you think?
Let's focus on that. But Emily, we have one question before we turn to reform. Emily?
Yes, thank you very much. And this is a great question. Okay, so whether or not there is a middle class isn't the question of accountability and fair distribution of power an important question or problem within the Constitution? So basically, is the only definition of fairness an economic outcome? Or is there some other way to interpret fairness and democracy outside of economic consideration?
That's a perfectly good question. And I think the Constitution itself contains an answer to that question, which is that the rule of law and the principle of equal justice before law is another independent core definition of fairness. And it's one that I not only support, but that part of the reason I think reforms are required is that I don't think it's being honored today, especially when it comes to the way people of color and particularly Black Americans are being treated by the criminal justice system. So that's a core principle that I think is independent of economic outcomes. The point about the middle class is not about economic outcomes per se. It's about the fact that people believed historically, and Alexander Hamilton's a good example, that you really couldn't trust rich people to be fair to anybody except rich people. And you really probably couldn't trust poor people to be fair to anybody but poor people. You needed someone in between who was saying to both groups of people, wait a minute, hold on. This isn't going to be fair enough to us as well as to everyone else. So you had a balance within the democratic system. And most people think that at the time the Constitution was written, there actually was a fairly substantial American middle class. And my point earlier was not that I think the Constitution is necessarily about economic outcomes. It's about maintaining political balance and about making sure that whatever policy the country has to confront, whether it's the military draft or the war in Iraq, that the outcome is seen as broadly fair enough to people that we don't have people become so disaffected that they think guns are the answer.
Right. So, so what you're, to go back to the question, I think that's a terrific answer. Economic equality is not the only definition of fairness in a democracy. But I think what you're saying, it is one definition of fairness. And, also, if you want people to buy into the system, they got to feel like they got a shot, that they either have, that they have a comfortable level of living, or that they may get it, or that their kids may get it, right? And, what we're seeing right now is, it's getting more and more stratified. And so at some point, people are going to say, this is not working for me.
Exactly.
And that's going to determine, whether that leads to violence or dramatic constitutional reform. but it's going to lead to some powerful movement. And again, I think you're absolutely right about that. But to go back to the question, it's not the only definition of fairness.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And nor do I think that the Constitution was ever intended to create economic equality as such. It was clearly not intended to do that. And Bill, I would say, just to follow up quickly on your observation, that one of the most disturbing things that I learned in the course of working on my book is how sharply social mobility has declined over the last 4 or 5 decades. Because as you say, people need to believe, to use the hackneyed phrase, that if they play by the rules and work hard, they have a reasonable future ahead of them. And today, the social mobility realities are that many people not only don't believe that, there's no good reason for them to believe that.
Right.
And so we need a system that can maintain those kinds of promises to people. And it has nothing to do with creating economic equality. It has to do with things like making sure criminal justice is fair, making sure educational access is open, and so on. That's the social mobility stuff was really, really concerning to me. The data there is very clear and very disturbing.
Right. And again, and it's tied into, the kind of the rise of economic stratification. It just, and we're seeing it now, and it just seems like it's going to continue more in the future. So again, as we think through, what we as a society need to address, I think that's, you and I are in total agreement. That's something that we as a society need to address. And the question now is kind of how we do that. Right. And so your constitutional convention, is something I want to focus on. But let me just ask you, let's talk about kind of other less dramatic options and whether they'll work, right? So, so one thing that it seems to me that and again, we may disagree about how much of a difference they'll make, but if Supreme Court opinions change, which I think we're talking about a couple of 5-4 decisions, which I think are wrongly decided. I hope long term they will change, and maybe short term, but Citizens United,
right,
is one, campaign finance and gerrymandering. And the gerrymandering, I think actually the court is not as kind of locked into that as they are with Citizens United.
No, I think you're right about that. I got the impression from the Rucho decision on gerrymandering that the court was accepting the idea that Congress could legislate to eliminate gerrymandering if it chose to do that. And from what I can tell, the current legislation takes them up on that. As Citizens United goes, not only is the court dug in on that issue, but I don't think there's any realistic prospect that there's going to be an amendment reversing Citizens United. And I don't think I'm the only person who thinks that. Professor Larry Lessig, who's written a couple of very good books on the Constitution and constitutional reform, says he thinks there is zero chance that Congress will adopt any reversal amendment. And we're 10 years or so after Citizens United, and there are claims that despite the fact that Congress hasn't given it the time of day, and won't in the foreseeable future, that 20 states supposedly support reversal, which, if it were true, would still be 14 states short of what you needed. But more importantly, if you look at the numbers carefully, there aren't 20 states. Several of those states have not taken any formal action as a state. And the states that have taken formal action are divided almost evenly between states who say, what we want is for Congress to propose an amendment, and states who say, what we want is a constitutional convention that would consider an amendment. Now, if the states are evenly divided on that prospect, it doesn't augur well for either result occurring in the real world. So I hate to say this because Citizens United is a very unfortunate decision, but I can't see any prospect that it's going to be reversed in the foreseeable future.
Well, and I think that that's right. I think that, Justice Stevens's book, 6 Amendments, one of the amendments was essentially overturning Citizens United. But I think just as a predictive matter that that's not going to happen in the near future. I think what you can have, and the Brennan Center actually did a paper on this, is, go back to increased public financing. So in other words, kind of more government money. And I think that's something that may happen. So, that's, I think, a positive step that partially addresses Citizens United.
I can't say what I think the prospects for broad public financing would be, although so far Congress has lacked enthusiasm for any real public financing system. As you know, Bill, the existing sort of matching system required candidates to say they wouldn't raise money outside of the system, the matching fund system, and pretty uniformly, presidential candidates have said, no, I think I can actually do a lot better than that. And it may be the ethical thing to do to refuse to raise additional money, but hey, my opponents are doing it, so I'm doing it. The nuclear arms race in campaign financing is going to continue until someone, really puts a clamp on everybody in the business, because the big money is being spent on both sides of
Right.
politics. So.
Right.
So I'm not terribly optimistic about financing. The other thing you and I had talked a little bit about is the National Popular Vote Initiative, which in theory is an end run for the Electoral College. And I mean, I certainly favor getting rid of the Electoral College, but I'm skeptical about the prospect after 15 years that the NPVI is actually going to get adopted. You apparently don't agree with that.
Yeah, I actually, but let me just go back. One of the questions I think Emily asked, somebody asked about, what is Citizens United?
Yes, and if you have a short answer, that's great. If not, I can drop a resource in the chat that will explain it further.
Please.
So it's a Supreme Court decision 5-4 that basically said, political action committees can spend as much money as they want on electoral campaigns, so long as they don't coordinate with candidates. So it just totally removed funding limits, and we've just seen kind of the tremendous outpouring. It used to be that there were limits on what you could spend on candidates, but if George runs for Senate, and I have a political action committee and I don't coordinate with him, but I just say what a fabulous person he is and blizzard the airwaves, that's fine. So that that has really kind of totally transformed campaign finance.
It really did open the door to an enormous increase, not only in public financing, but in dark money contributions, of which there have now been probably at least $1 billion worth. Money that nobody knows where it came from, nobody knows why it's there. And so far, Congress hasn't done anything at all about dark money, even though the Supreme Court more or less conceded that they had the power to do that. It's one of the reasons I'm skeptical about reversal, is Congress can't even get to the first step, if you will.
But I mean, if you look at, when you watch TV, you'll see a lot of things that look like campaign ads, but they're done by PACs, and you'll find that at the end. And also, just to go on the disclosure, which is something that looked like it was open, but Supreme Court decisions last year in the California case, that suggests that even disclosure may kind of violate the First Amendment. So, I'm not even sure that that's going to stick.
Right. I understand that decision, puts a cloud over that issue. Emily, did you have more questions you thought we should take?
There is another really excellent question, but I think I'm going to reserve it for after you have an opportunity to talk about the structure that you envision for making substantive change.
Okay. So let me just ask you one question.
Sure.
So one of the things that that you really focus on very powerfully in your book is that there was a big discrepancy between the size of Virginia and Delaware,
right,
in 1787, but California is just immensely bigger than Wyoming now in a way that's just almost an order of magnitude different.
right.
And so people like Madison were unhappy with the original framework, but this takes it and now it's on steroids.
Yes.
Right. So that's one of the, and then that affects the Electoral College as well as the Senate. So now here's one thing that I was thinking of reading your book, and I wanted to get your reaction before we get to the larger question. Should California split itself into a number of states? So there was actually a movement a few years ago to put on the ballot to split California in 3 states. And periodically there have been talk about splitting Texas into 4 states. Is that something that's short of a constitutional convention? Or, DC becomes a state,
Right,
Puerto Rico becomes a state. So,
right.
that would, within our existing constitutional framework,
Right.
we would still look more like at least 1787 than we do now. What do you think about that as a possible, not a full solution, but a partial solution?
I guess this isn't something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, except in one context. There is a book by Richard Treanor about the history of secession movements in the United States, which came out a year or 2 ago. And it's a very well-written book that does a good job of describing the history. And there have been secession movements of various kinds throughout United States history. I personally think that one of the reasons we fought the Civil War was to establish the principle that nobody got to decide by themselves whether or not they were going to be seceding from the Union.
Yeah, but let me just, before you go further, it's not,
sure.
California's splitting into 4 states.
No, I understand that.
Right.
What I'm saying is, I'm not sure it's up to California.
No, but it's actually, there's a constitutional, I've looked at this. There's
Right.
a constitutional provision about this. And so what you need is California's got to endorse it and Congress has to endorse it.
Right. And so
Right.
Congress, the question of whether Congress endorses it is really, as far as I'm concerned, the big question, because there you're reallocating the voting structure of the Senate. And I literally have no way to know what would happen in the abstract, because I don't know how many other people would say, well, California's going to do this. I think Illinois should do this. I think New York should do this. I think we need 30 more senators. I mean, it could turn out that it's a very good thing, but there would be an awful lot of people in states that couldn't split up who would think that was not the deal. There is a good example, in my view, of something you'd want to debate in a convention.
Right, but
the convention itself literally allocated seats in the House of Representatives. You know that they sat down and they said, I think North Carolina should have 3. And someone else came in and said, no, I think they should have 4. And so the convention itself allocated the seats because they were making a deal that they thought of as a grand bargain. And one of the elements of the bargain was, how many votes are you going to get in Congress? So I think that if California and other states that thought that was a great example, decided they wanted to do this, they would be potentially significantly shifting the voting structure of both, as the way the Constitution works, they'd be changing the voting structure of both the House and the Senate, both of them. And I personally think that rather than having this Congress with its dismal performance make that decision, it would be better to make it in the broader context of deciding what we thought about our national decision-making system and how we would reallocate authority both between the federal government and the states and between individual states and each other. It's another example of my skepticism about changing one thing without thinking really carefully about what it's going to do to the rest of the system would be, I think, my reaction.
Okay, so somebody put in, I think Emily, somebody put in the chat the admissions clause of the Constitution, which is what would permit this. And we've seen it historically. Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. Kentucky used to be part of Virginia. West Virginia used to be part of Virginia. So we have and Tennessee used to be part. North Carolina and Tennessee used to be one state.
All of those splits make the basic point that I'm making. They were all made between free states and slave states. They were points that was struck all the way through 1820.
Yeah, no, actually, they were
literally made. Bill made
the
first one, and it came in in a trade. It came in a trade for Kentucky.
Right, but the other 2 were no. That's not true. Kentucky came in very early, so Kentucky before Maine. Maine is later. Maine is 1820. It's Kentucky and Tennessee come in the 1790s, right?
Literally, the course of admissions for the first 20 or 30 years was the North gets a state, the South gets a state.
Now, that's actually, I mean, that's a separate and fascinating, maybe we'll get invited back to Montpelier on that, but I would disagree with you on that as a historical
I
map.
think
Maine is an
it's worth-
example. Maine and Missouri come in together.
Yeah, and
Stop, let me just finish.
sure.
But Kentucky and Tennessee come in early before they realize, before they're kind of locked in on free state and northern states. And actually the North is stupid because they have Vermont, which is the 14th state,
Right.
and then they should stop and they let in Kentucky and Tennessee. But let's go back to, that'll be when we're invited back by
Okay.
Roy and Emily. But let's talk about your book and your basic, we got 24 minutes. Talk about your thesis and the case for it and the responses to it.
Okay. So the basic argument that I make in the book is that because there is a need, a clear, compelling need for large-scale reform of the Constitution, and because it's fairly clear that many of the structural reforms that are clearly necessary can't be made through individual amendments or by Supreme Court decisions and so on, that really the way you're going to do this, if you're going to get reform, is you're going to hold a constitutional convention. Because frankly, there is no other viable reform route. You've suggested a series of what I would think of as somewhat smaller reforms, but you're not going to restructure the separation of powers outside of a convention. You're not going to change the structure of the Senate outside of a convention, because people are simply not going to tolerate that from the existing political system. So I think a convention really is necessary. And what, by and large, the arguments against it are, oh, that would be worse than what we have now, or, oh, you couldn't possibly actually get anything done, or, gosh, you would just be dominated by the Koch brothers, to be very, sort of broad brush about the whole thing. So let me just try and take some of these objections and talk about them. First of all, it seems to me it's eminently practical to hold a convention. It's clear you could raise the money to hold a convention. It's clear that we can run fair and open elections, whether it's outside of the existing electoral system, which doesn't work very well at all, as we all know, or not. So it's practical to do this. People worry about a runaway convention. My goodness, they might change everything. Well, Philadelphia Convention in 1787 was a runaway convention. So not all runaway conventions are a bad idea. But the fact of the matter is the convention has no authority of any kind whatsoever over anything unless and until its proposals are ratified. And the only ratification system that is going to achieve any public acceptance is going to require a supermajority for ratification. If you say it's going to be a simple majority, I think it's a non-starter. There are people who propose that. I think that's fundamentally misguided. There has to be supermajority ratification, and supermajority ratification is going to create political safeguards against extreme proposals. We know that the 1787 convention did not make proposals that its members all supported because it was worried that the Constitution wouldn't be ratified. And we know that some of the proposals that were killed at the convention would have guaranteed that the Constitution would be defeated. James Madison's a great example. He proposed that Congress have a complete veto over any state action of any kind. And I can assure you, having looked at the dynamics of ratification, that that would have killed the Constitution, unquestionably killed it. And yet Madison was convinced that it was so important that he wrote letters to Thomas Jefferson complaining about the fact that he didn't get what he wanted out of the convention. I don't think anyone is going to get everything they want out of a convention. That's why it's a good idea. People are going to have to come to the table, and in return for getting some of what they think is important in the way of reform, they're going to have to agree to some things in the way of reform that they don't like. And that's what a grand bargain is. The 1787 Constitution is a classic grand bargain. No one got everything they wanted out of it. And in fact, some of what's in it turned out to be a really bad idea. But it was a way of taking an intersectional conflict that threatened to break the country up and resolving it with a stable government that was able to support the expansion of the country across the continent. So conventions are practical. They're not anywhere near as dangerous as people say they are, despite the fact that they may produce some things that some people don't like. There are political safeguards that can be built into the system. And, you know, I have to say, having spent a lot of time listening to people complain, today there are people who complain about the idea that a convention would be convened under Article 5. In my book, I give examples of people who say, oh, even the existing amendment system is so dangerous that we shouldn't even think about using it. Those are people who are essentially saying, I don't want to see anything change. Or if I do see anything change, I want to control the levers of change. You're not going to be able to do that in this process. You're going to have to come to the table and reach an agreement. So that's my basic reaction to the criticisms of the convention. People, they're only going to accept this when they don't have any other alternative. That's clear. As long as I think Citizens United is going to get reversed, I will never agree to hold a constitutional convention. So part of what I'm trying to say to people is wake up, smell the coffee. You're not going to get what you want, and you're not going to get anything fundamental changed unless and until there's a convention.
Good. Okay. Actually, so Emily, there are a couple of questions in the chat. So why don't you ask George that, and then I'll jump in.
Absolutely. So there's a few structural questions
Sure.
about how you envision this working. So for example, number one, who would be allowed to participate in a convention of this kind?
Right.
A follow-up being, how would they be selected?
Right.
A third then being, the Philadelphia Convention was notably closed to the public, and the participants were not to discuss with the broader society, with the press or anyone, what was happening. Do you
Right.
envision a convention of this nature to be similar? Is this something that would happen behind closed doors in an effort to make coming to compromises easier?
Those are all really good questions. I believe it's the case that my book addresses each one of them in detail. And I don't have time here to give detailed responses. But what I would say is I envision a popularly run process. And by that, I mean a group of concerned citizens would organize a committee that would have as its purpose establishing a call for a convention. It would say when the convention should be held. It would say what the basic ground rules for electing delegates would be, and so on and so on. And it would put that out essentially to the public as a proposal for a convention. And if there were enough public support to raise the money that would be part of the call, then the convention could proceed. In a sense, it's a little bit like running a political campaign in Texas. If you're Beto O'Rourke and you're running against a powerful incumbent, you raise $80 million in crowd-funded contributions so that there's no question whatsoever that you're going to be able to go forward with your campaign. Now, as it happens, you know, that you don't always win. And that might happen here as well. But the point is, this would be a popular process to organize what is essentially a private association. And by that, I mean, it would be a meeting held by the elected delegates, but without any form of federal or state funding or sanction. So that this would be a group that would be protected by the First Amendment and not subject to claims that somehow it was violating someone's rights in an untoward way, unless it violated, you know, civil rights laws or something like that. There's no question in my mind that people are going to fight bitterly against any proposal like this. I don't think it matters. In 1787, several major states fought bitterly against even convening the Philadelphia Convention. They tried as best as they could New York and Massachusetts in particular, to rob the delegates of the power to make any fundamental change to the Confederation. Just absolutely bitterly oppose this. In the New York Senate, Hamilton and his colleagues who wanted to see a convention prevailed by one vote. So there's no question that there's going to be bitter opposition. I don't think it matters one bit. In the United States today, everybody who's unhappy runs to court. But under the structure I'm proposing, those court cases are losers because this is privately raised money in small contributions to put together a large meeting to make proposals. As to the question of public access and participation, obviously circumstances are different today. I'd say in the book, the convention is going to have to decide how to balance the need for in some level of confidentiality and privacy, as opposed to simply being broadcast on TV 24/7. But that's something the convention can work out for itself at the time. Congress, I don't know if most people know this or not, but Congress commonly closes sessions to the public when it decides that national security is at stake, or defense issues are at stake, or intelligence issues are at stake. The public doesn't say, oh, we've got a right to know. It says, obviously, Congress has a good reason for closing this part of their meetings. And they've been doing that for 200 years. As I recall, part of the Watergate impeachment was held in executive session, again, for fairly good reason. So there's going to be a balance that's going to have to be struck by the people who put this together. I don't know if you can say in advance exactly what the balance should be, but my broad point is that the fact that people don't like the idea of holding a convention, my first response is, tell me what you think is a better plan if you accept the fact that none of your individual proposals are going to go anywhere otherwise. Aren't you really saying that you think the Constitution is unamendable and will never change? And Bill, you were the one who pointed out to me that you are not a huge fan of the living Constitution, which is all you'd be left with if you take the position that the Constitution cannot be amended. So the first problem folks have if they oppose a convention is explaining how they're going to get anything done in the way of structural reform. The second problem is that they got to get beyond pretextual objections. It may run away. I'm not going to get what I want. They might do something terrible, and explain what it is that's really wrong with holding a national meeting to get to the heart of these problems. When George Washington was preparing for the 1787 convention, he wrote to James Madison and said that he wanted Madison to pursue radical reforms without regard to how anyone felt about them, because they needed to get to the heart of what was wrong with the Confederation. And, you know, I give Washington enormous credit for understanding that the Confederation was so fundamentally broken that someone was going to have to figure out how to change it from the heart forward. And I think we're in the same position here, honestly. You know, when people start to give interviews to the New York Times talking about how it's going to take violence to make change, I personally, as someone who favors peaceful change and who doesn't like the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or anything remotely like it as a way of doing business for a government, I get really concerned about that, especially when I think that people have a reason to be unhappy. So it's time, I think, for people who have proposals. For example, I mentioned this Princeton thing to you earlier, I think, Bill, that a series of Princeton alumni were asked about their views on constitutional reform. And one of them said, gosh, I think it should be easier to amend the Constitution. So do I. But you know what? That's never going to happen unless there's a convention. No one is going to agree to change Article 5 outside of a convention. That's just as clear as it could possibly be. And I think we need to get past the point where people can offer up proposals for reform that they would like to see happen without having to give any thought whatsoever to how it is those reforms might actually be possible. Because really, otherwise, you're just kind of like school kids painting with tempera on a piece of glass. We're not making political change. So that's what I think the convention issue is really about.
So let me ask, I mean, I think this is a very important book. And I think it's, as we're thinking through how we move forward, you're having us think about, do we, in some sense, almost start from scratch, is very powerful. And, I think will lead to very rich discussion. What I'd like to do is let me raise one concern, and then I think Emily has one question that she wants to ask to close. I mean, one of my concerns about this is, would it work in today's very polarized society, right? So, when the 1787, first of all, you didn't have the same kind of polarization, I think, that you have now. The legislatures all endorsed, except for Rhode Island, supported the sending people to the Federal Constitutional Convention. It was within the governmental system. When you had state ratifying conventions, again, within the governmental system. And, the strongest opponents, ultimately accepted the system, right? So Patrick Henry, the leading anti-federalist in Virginia, becomes a Federalist governor. He accepts the results of the ratifying convention, which is a paper thin margin in Virginia. Governor Clinton in New York fights the Constitution, but when he loses, accepts the outcome and ultimately becomes vice president, right? So the losers buy in. I have to say, if you have what you're proposing, let's say 80% of the people vote in favor of it. First of all, you're going to have 20% who oppose it.
Right.
You're going to have people who say, we're not going to vote. So the 20% doesn't begin to, right now we have, incredible opposition to standard voting, right? What would be the opposition that we're going to see? So my question, before we go to Emily's final question is, isn't this going to produce in our polarized society, this is just not going to be accepted, even if you get a vote that is overwhelmingly in favor of the convention's document?
I think you raise a really important question. Polarization is a fact of our political life. And many people are concerned that it makes it impossible for us to agree about much of anything. There are two ways you can go in a really polarized society. One is one group can overwhelm the other group, and the other is the society can dissolve. Neither of those outcomes is anything we should be looking forward to in the United States. Now, let me go back to your points about the Philadelphia Convention. I'll explain why I think it's actually a much better analogy for today. First of all, the country was incredibly polarized in 1787. If you go back to my Confederation book, there's an entire chapter explaining that Congress had essentially had dissolved with no definite date for return several months before the convention. Why was that? Well, because the Spanish treaty issue was so divisive that people were talking about the need to leave the Confederation completely. The reason that Patrick Henry didn't serve as a delegate was that he was convinced that the same guys who were trying to sell the Spanish treaty would find a way to stick it into the Constitution and make him eat it. And he thought that was the end of the South as a political entity. So there was enormous polarization, Bill. I mean, just enormous polarization. I really strongly encourage anybody who hasn't followed the Spanish treaty impasse in 1786 to go back and take a hard look at it, because it was driving the country completely apart. That's why Washington thought it was necessary to have a convention. The second point you made is, oh, the states all endorsed this. No, actually, that's not quite what happened. What happened was that Virginia put out a call for a convention at the end of 1786, and several states quickly jumped on board, even though the Continental Congress actually had the exclusive authority to call a convention, and it had opposed an earlier proposal for a convention. The states went ahead without them, outside the Confederation's rules. And at that point, Massachusetts and New York tried to find a way to stick a fork in the process by killing it completely or making sure that the delegates had no power. So this was not uniform endorsements. Pieces of paper that people later put together to say, we'll send delegates. Washington didn't agree to go to the convention until he was sure that every state not only would send delegates, but would send them with unrestricted authority and would send people that he thought would be willing to come to the table and actually reach an agreement. If you read the correspondence between the governor of Virginia and Washington about this, Washington turned down 2 appointments to be a delegate to the convention, before he finally ultimately agreed. And he agreed because by about 6 weeks before the convention, he finally concluded that there was a real basis for believing that this polarized country would actually be willing to come together and try and work out an intersectional grand bargain. There were huge sectional differences of opinion, and the sections essentially compromised them in Philadelphia. That's what Washington wanted to get done, to move enough power to the federal government to give it the ability to run the country as a whole and to resolve sectional controversy. So among other things, for example, the Northwest Ordinance got passed just by coincidence during the Philadelphia Convention. The Spanish Treaty was killed just by coincidence, more or less during the Philadelphia Convention, because a grand bargain, an intersectional agreement was being created. So do I think that today is kind of like that? Yes, I do. I think it's kind of like that. And I think we have a similar choice to make about the future of the country at this point. We can continue to sort of move around the edges and think, well, if we could just get rid of the filibuster, everything would be fine. Okay. Well, let me tell you, it's clear from the Constitution's political structure that getting rid of the filibuster is not going to make everything fine. Climate change legislation, for example, isn't going to do any better after the filibuster is gone than it would do before. Gun control legislation won't do any better after the end of the filibuster than it would have done before. So we can, as I say, we can sort of tinker around the margins in a variety of ways, or we can come to terms with the fact that the kind of rioting that took place, I guess it's 2 years ago now, was a real expression of genuine unhappiness with the core way that we've been running the society on behalf of a lot of people. And the people who were involved in the demonstrations, peaceful protests, and so on, were a very large group of people, probably as large as the Vietnam War if you added up all the people. So there's real unhappiness, and we have a choice about how we address it. And I'm real skeptical, and this is what the book says, that under the existing structure, very much that matters is actually going to get resolved. And I'm not alone. Aziz Rana, who's a rising young constitutional scholar, talked to the New York Times and said he thinks the government is headed toward institutional paralysis. I think that's exactly right. We're simply not addressing these issues.
So I think, I think everything you're saying is right about the history of 1787. I do think that there was a legal sanction that's very different from what you're envisioning, and that'll be very important. But I think Emily has kind of one big question that we should leave on because it really goes to the fundamentals. Emily?
It does. And actually, George, you've referenced it a little bit already. So the question from earlier was, the biggest world crises today are climate change, pandemics, and economic wealth disparity. And the biggest stakeholders in all of those issues are children and then generations yet unborn who have no voice, they have no direct influence in the process that you're describing. And the questioner goes on to say the writers of the Constitution were not thinking about climate change or pandemics or economic disparity. They were solving the problems of now. So is there a way to create a constitution or a system that will prioritize the interests of children and generations yet unborn instead of just solving the problems of now?
So let me answer that. And then I think, George, since it's your book, I think you should close. But it's a terrific question. And, to some extent, this was a big debate between Madison and Jefferson. Jefferson said, 20 years, you shouldn't be legislating beyond that. You shouldn't be legislating for future generations. And what Madison was trying to do was to put in place a framework that was sufficiently supple so that future generations would be heard. So that, that was a great debate in 1787. It continues now. And I think, the question, and I think, the big problem with the Constitution is, as the questioner says, it's more than 200 years old, and the people were responding to a very different set of circumstances. So, I think in some sense, the compelling force of George's book is to say, shouldn't we be thinking now about both ourselves and what comes ahead? And, I think, the reason why ultimately I think I'm reluctant to sign on with George is that, I think that Madison's recognition of the importance of a constitutional framework, particularly at this moment where we're dealing with such a divided society, outweighs kind of moving and starting from scratch. But, George makes the case very powerfully, even though I disagree with it. So George, closing.
So I also think it's a great question about how to reconcile the interest of different generations in a constitutional framework. And Bill is certainly right that Madison and Jefferson had radically different views about that. I personally think that at the core of this problem is resilience. The government needs to be resilient. It needs to be able to cope with changed conditions and even dramatically changed conditions. The pandemic would be an example. And what I'm confident of is that today's government lacks resilience. It is a rigid system that does not have the trust of our citizens. And as a result, when we try to change social behavior relatively quickly, as we did during the pandemic, an awful lot of people say, I'm not on that train. I don't trust those guys. And, we need a government that can be resilient, and we need to create the incentives to look to the future. And that's why climate change is so significant in this debate. I really am firmly convinced that one of the fundamental problems we have with getting decent climate change legislation in the United States is the structure of the Senate. Because you look at the voting patterns in the Senate and ask yourself, who is going to be voting for significant climate change legislation in the Senate? And you're going to find a lot of the folks that have been given disproportionate authority. There are 28 states that have 56% of the votes in the Senate and 20% of our population. And they have a controlling interest block in the Senate if they decide to oppose climate change. So we need a resilient system. We need a system that can change to meet change conditions and to protect the interests of the future generations. And the current Constitution does not do that. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much for your perspectives this evening. It's been really, really fascinating. So thank you all for the viewers, and thank you all for your excellent questions. And we certainly hope that you keep this conversation going, whether it's around your dinner table or with friends. This is certainly an issue that this is far from over. So we really look forward to seeing how this conversation plays out coming up.
Bill, thank you.
Yes,
And
thank
Emily,
you, Bill. Thank you, George.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thank you, Roy. And thank you for all of our participants. It was a great conversation.
All right, and I will just mention very briefly for those of you who are eager to have more Montpelier content, we have a program that's going to be called the 5 Freedoms, which will start Tuesday night at 7, and that will be a 6-week series on the different elements of the First Amendment. So please join us for that if you have not signed up already. Roy?
Just a big thank you to all of our members, to Emily, George, and Bill. So signing off, have a great night, and thank you for a stimulating conversation. See you all on Tuesday.
Thank you all very much.
Take care.
Thank you.